and welcome to QTV. We've got another fantastic show for you this week. First off, we'll be chatting to DJ and disability advocate Jake Lewis. We'll bring you all the glamour and fun and excitement of Sydney's lesbian and gay Mardi Gras. Catherine Dixon will talk all about the work being done to curtail hate speech. And our Moments in Time series will take a look at the flats and boarding houses that were used in the early 20th century in St Kilda for the Q+ community.
Okay, so my name's Jake. I am a DJ and disability advocate in Melbourne. Two very different things. I've lived in Melbourne my entire life, or always lived in St Kilda. My parents sort of separated when I was young, and my mum moved to St Kilda where we lived, and my dad stayed in Alphington. So I sort of went between the two homes. Yeah, like I had lots of surgery when I was a very small child, in the first sort of 5 years of my life, 6 years. So that was obviously quite full on. Some people, like they're sort of diagnosed with a disability later on in life, whereas for me, it's just my normal. I don't know if this can go on TV, but I call it the no fucks given attitude towards it all, like just, like a nonchalant attitude towards it. And also I work in disability, so I don't like to make the work about me. If you treat someone like they're kind of broken, they will internalise that. And that's not what my family did at all. And I think that that's a key. So that's the thing, I've got all of the supports in place, so that's where it becomes different for other people. So I'm very lucky in that sense. But at the same time, when I was younger, all I wanted to do was fit in. Now that I'm older, I'm happy to stand out a little bit. And so in that sense, I've kind of been able to kind of lean into it a little bit. There's been a really big push towards kind of understanding disability from an intersectional approach. If you look at any kind of disability action plan from any time period before 5 years ago, there was no sense of any kind of identity. Whereas now it's actually much more holistic. It's more understanding who the person is and how to support them. A trans person who has autism is going to be very different to a gay person with a disability, with a physical disability. It's going to be very different. But at the moment, there really is a need to kind of band together and advocate together, because we're still sort of building a foothold. It sort of dawns on you, doesn't it? You're just like, oh God. All right, cool, I'm gay. What am I going to do about that? How am I going to manage that? What does that mean? What do I do? Who do I talk to? So I genuinely struggled to sort of face up to it. My solution to that was to kind of just hit the pause button and kind of just lose myself in Melbourne's nightclub scene. I felt very, not very confident initially entering kind of queer spaces. I'm someone that's sort of always been good at attracting cool people and sort of cultivating interesting people around me. So I guess that's kind of been my kind of defense mechanism against all of that sort of bullshit. Once I turned 18 and started going out to nightclubs, I was like, boom, that is what I want to do. I looked at the DJ and I was like, boom, that is it. Back then there was a very big separation between DJ and promoter. You sort of were one or the other. There were more barriers to becoming a DJ. And I was sort of heavily into rock and roll, but I would get tickets from a guy called Christo, who ran a stage called the Lily Pad. And he was a DJ, and I always looked up to him. And that sort of piqued my interest, sort of watching him and watching him operate, and also slowly kind of finding my way into the boiler room, which is the DJ sort of area. And just eventually I went from the rock and roll stage to just exclusively just being in the boiler room. The technology mimics the spinning records. The difference is you don't have to spend, copious amounts of time and money acquiring these records and carrying them around. I tend to be a warm-up DJ, which is, I think it's a critical set to play, because if you're blasting a room full of people early on, you should go home and rethink your life. J Chard's my DJ name. It's what I signed up to MySpace back in the day. And once I'd used that name, it sort of became my name once I'd sort of put it on the internet. Me and a couple of friends put together the Pride March after party at the SB this year, and it was just such a great party. Like, it just sort of really came together nicely. So yeah, it was really cool to see like a really sort of mainstream place like the SB just go full-blown rainbow for one day. I think in the 21st century, in Australia, a disability shouldn't hold you back.
Coming up next, we've got all the glamour and sparkle of the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras. Next up, we'll be listening to Catherine Dixon, who spoke to Joy 94.9's Saturday Magazine programme, and after that we'll be taking a look at the liberating role of the flats in St Kilda.
I know you've been doing some work on his hate speech.
That's right, Mecca.
Define it for us, what it is, and tell us about the work that's going on.
The Commission is responsible for the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, and that's the current act in Victoria that protects people against hate crimes, hate speech and hate conduct if that speech and that conduct happens because of their race or religion. And I suppose the definition is really any public conduct that incites hatred of a person or groups of people because of their race or religion. As I said, it could be a crime, but it could also be verbal abuse, but it could also be a whole range of other conduct, harassment, bullying, and just, I suppose, a whole range of non-criminal conduct as well, but it's all prejudice motivated.
Okay.
So, flags, graffiti, flyers, online abuse. The inquiry that's going on at the moment is a parliamentary inquiry.
This is a state parliamentary inquiry?
That's right. So it's a state parliamentary inquiry into whether our current vilification laws are effective and how they might be able to be improved. The difficulty with our current laws, it's a very high threshold to meet the current test of vilification, which is essentially that your conduct inspires a third person to hate. To hate that, Hindus, for example, or people of Muslim background. So it doesn't really matter how you might feel, Tass or Macca. It really matters whether someone else is inspired to hate.
Right.
So it's quite difficult to prove. There's a lot of good evidence to say that we don't have current protections for the LGBTIQ community when it comes to hate speech.
But some will say what this is about, it's about reducing freedom of speech.
This is one of those great examples of where rights can compete against each other, and you have to try and work out how they can be balanced together, because obviously in our democracy freedom of speech is critical, but so is protecting our inclusive and diverse society. So there's currently exceptions in the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, which enables people, if they're acting reasonably and in good faith, to make comments that may be artistic in nature, academic, religious or scientific, as long as they're acting reasonably and in good faith.
Now, if their beliefs are, that the LGBTIQ community should be set on fire, well, that's obviously offensive and is hate speech.
And it may induce somebody to violence. So
that's an example. We've seen many examples of that sort of comment. It's a really difficult balance, isn't it, Catherine? Because we all want to be able to have opinions and express our views, and sometimes it will be offensive to other people, but it's where it actually causes harm or causes other people to do harm, isn't it? That's the crux of it.
We're recommending at the Commission that we ought to, at the state level, have a harm-based test, which really means that if you're insulted, humiliated, intimidated on the basis of, your sexual orientation, for example, then there ought to be an avenue for you to complain. This inquiry is really about how can we strengthen the existing laws and extend them to other groups that need protection. So we're hoping that once this inquiry makes recommendations, that then the government will strengthen the law. The government made a submission, and I think they are interested, certainly the consultations that we've had with them, and we've consulted with all different kinds of communities, women, people with disability, the LGBTIQ community, to try and see what people think. We've conducted sort of survey work, we've consulted with government, and there is a lot of interest in how we can better protect people against hate conduct and hate speech.
How effective are things like hate laws? I mean, is there evidence that they will get used or can get used? I mean, what have we learnt from other jurisdictions and other places?
First of all, we need to get the law right and the regulation right, the right penalties, the right tests, so that those barriers are removed. But then there's a whole really education and awareness raising campaign that these laws exist, what complaint avenues are available to people, trying to reduce the barriers for people to make complaints. I guess the other thing too is at the Commission we feel that this shouldn't always be driven by individuals making complaints. There has to be proper investigative powers for regulatory bodies to deal with it, whether that's online hate or whether that's bodies like ours. So one of our recommendations is that we have stronger powers. For example, if there's an unknown respondent, that we can compel information to find that respondent, that people are able to come to us through anonymous complaints through a representative body to make it easier for them.
In effect, 4 St Kildas over the last 180 years. A small seaside village, an enjoyable place to go for weekends or longer holidays. The kind of deterioration in the early 20th century when it became pretty grungy and gritty. And now the gentrified Bohemia. During the first 2 periods, it was the kind of place that people could go for a pleasant time. But beginning with the Great Depression of the 1890s, a lot of the grand houses and hotels were converted into boarding houses. This opened up opportunities for camp people in a quite unexpected sort of way. Prior to the 1920s, it was normal to live at home with your family until you got married, moved out and started a family of your own. The rise of the boarding houses and then of the flats, or apartments as we might call them, really changed this a lot. It made it possible for people to move out of home. It was appealing to professional young women, and it was appealing to camp women and men in particular. In the apartments in particular, it was possible to live alone or to live with friends or one particular friend as a couple. The apartments offered privacy and they also offered affordability. They were much cheaper than trying to buy a house, but they were also more private than either home or the boarding houses. Boarding houses, for example, were run by landladies who had a vested interest, of course, in keeping them respectable in order to attract paying clientele. And this meant that they tended to keep a close eye on what their clientele were up to all the time. In the 1920s, Reg Flevel and Neil Urquhart lived in a boarding house in St Kilda. Reg was a pantryman and Neil was an electrician, so they weren't particularly well paid, but they could afford to live in a boarding house, except that their landlady became upset about the fact that 2 men were sharing a single bed. She called the cops and Reg ended up in jail. So when the flats or the apartments started to go up to the 1920s, they were even more attractive. They didn't have landladies. There was a lot more privacy. They weren't the kind of boxy accommodation that we might think of when we think of flats. Rather, they tended to be rather grand and tended to appeal to people with a bit of surplus money. They were often large and well decorated. Henry Lewis's apartment was described as being decorated with Persian carpets, great brass gongs, curios, pictures on the walls, a very glamorous, expensive kind of place to live in. The apartments offered a degree of privacy, much more so than the boarding houses, for example, but not absolute. Truth, for example, a notorious scandal sheet, became very interested in the ways in which the apartments were reshaping St Kilda. In 1921, Truth referred to St Kilda and its apartments as flatland, creating a sense that there was something wrong with this, that it was undesirable. It talked about the area being infested with pests and specified these pests as curious creatures, painted and powdered effeminates. All of this may have changed a bit since then, particularly the styles, but nonetheless St Kilda remains an important part of Melbourne queer life.
Wasn't it heartwarming to see the role of the flats in St Kilda really to try and give young people a real break from their families and begin their Q life journeys? A heartwarming story there. But that's it from us on QTV this evening. Join us again next week for some more great stories. Good night.